through Turnitin. Right, so basically you'll have to email them to me or Zoe. I'll hand in a physical copy and we'll scroll on it and give it back to you. Right, cool. But we aim to get them back with feedback within 2 weeks. Okay, so now the light is on and we can actually have a lecture. So, what are we doing today? Today we are doing Anselm, and we are talking about the relationships between faith and reason. And what this means is that we need to talk a bit more about what we mean by reason, as much as what we mean by faith. So the questions that I have given us this week, which we're going to break down, right, are a little bit like last week. What can or can't be proved? And that, you might say, is kind of talking about the limits of reason. So the relationship between faith and reason is often going to be a dialogue about the limits of reason. However, in order to really get a grip on this, we need to understand what we mean by proved, or by proof. So, what's a proof? What is a proof? Here's a way of breaking this down. First of all, we might think about a proof as evidence. Right? So we might think of that as some intuition. Right? And we might think about that intuition as perhaps being a matter of observation, like looking at things in the world, like empirical science does. So, observation. Right? It might not be, it might be a mathematical intuition, right? Which seems to be somewhat different. But we might also think about it in terms of revelation. And this is the key sort of concept in theology, is some kind of intuitive evidence of the existence of God or the nature of the divine. Okay, evidence. However, the thing that we're more interested in here is argument. And what's an argument? This is quite important if you're going to be writing essays, because you're going to have to be making arguments. Right, so I want to break an argument down into 3 things. And this is also something some of you will be studying with Daniel Kochi, so I apologise to Dan for going over the same thing. But we can break down arguments into 3 things. Premises, conclusions, and inferences. So a premise is what you start with, a conclusion is what you get to, and an inference is how you get from one to the other. I'm going to close this door. So, for instance, here's the simple argument that always gets used throughout the history of philosophy. If I say, Socrates is a man, all men are mortals, therefore Socrates is mortal. Right. What I've got there is 2 premises and a conclusion. And I've got to the conclusion by making a certain type of inference. Let me break down this in terms of types. And by the way, I understand I'm giving you a lot of information here. Right? Don't feel bad if you don't follow it all. It's stuff you can go back to. Crucially, when we talk about premises, we might again talk about evidence. Right? Right? All this stuff we're talking about up here might be the source of how we're getting our argument. Right? We might also talk about the conclusion of another argument. we might take the end of our previous argument as the conclusion as the premise for our next one. However, what we might also talk about is definitions. Right? We might begin our argument from, let's say, definition. We might begin our argument from a definition. So, for instance, when I was in that argument about Socrates, you might say that the second premise, all men are mortal, that might just be a definition. Right? Human beings are just by definition mortal. Right? We might disagree with that or not, but that's one way of getting that premise. Right? Conclusions. Right? I want to introduce a slight distinction, just because it might help you, between what you call a dispositive and a probative conclusion. And this is basically a difference in what you can do with your conclusion. A dispositive conclusion is one you must believe. Right? The argument, if it's ironclad and valid, right, means you just have to believe the conclusion. Right? So if your premises are true in a certain kind of argument, then your conclusion has to be true. And philosophers tend to focus on this kind of argument, but there's also arguments that produce what we call probative conclusions, and they're ones that incline you to believe it, but there might be some wiggle room, right? And this is most of the arguments we actually make in real life. Most of the arguments we actually make are kind of like, here, I've given you a case for why you should think this way, right? And that case makes it likely that the thing I'm talking about, the conclusion, is true, but there might be some things we haven't accounted for. Right? That's a kind of probative conclusion for an argument. Finally, we can talk about types of inference. So there is classically deductive inference, or let's just call it deduction. Right? And deduction is the stuff that gives you dispositive conclusions. So famously, Sherlock Holmes takes this kind of approach. Like, once you've discarded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Right? Deductive arguments are the kinds of things we get in mathematics. You start with definitions, and you deduce from those definitions absolutely true conclusions that no one can ignore. We also get kinds of argument that you might call induction and abduction. These are less interesting or relevant, but they turn up in the empirical sciences. Whenever you want to say, look, I've seen the sun rise a bunch of times, right? It's risen for the entirety of my life, therefore it's just going to always rise, right? That's a kind of inductive argument. Right? Any kind of argument about probability, where you say, look, I've seen this many cases, I think we can infer from that a generalization. That's induction. Abduction is more like what gets called inference to the best explanation. Right? So, like, if my neighbour's car is still in his driveway, I might go, probably off work today. Might be sick. Right? That seems like the best explanation for that fact. But there are a variety of reasons that might go against it. Right? Might be that he's gone to work but his car's broken, so he's got a lift. Right? That's again a kind of probative conclusion. Okay. That's very technical, right? But it gives you a basic idea of roughly all the ways in which we argue for conclusions and what we're doing when we're doing it. The final thing to mention is that what I've called an argument here is what you'd technically call monological. It's like a monologue. Right? All of these arguments I've been talking about are things you can do on your own. Right? But another word that we occasionally use here is debate. Right? And debate is dialogical. Right? And what we're doing here, you know, when we're learning about the history of philosophy and theology, and we're talking about arguments, is we're retracing debates. We're retracing someone who gave an argument for one position, and then someone else came in and produced a criticism of it, and then argued for their own, and vice versa, and you get this kind of like, over the history of philosophy, people making arguments and refutations against one another. Right? And it's worth understanding that that's still proof in a certain sense. We're still talking about argument, still talking about logic. It's just slightly more complicated than here are my premises and here's my conclusion. Right? And almost any essay you write will not be a monologue. It won't be a, like, okay, here are my premises, here's my conclusion. Right? Often what you'll be doing is saying, here's one position, here's another. Here's the arguments for it, and here's the arguments against it. Here's the arguments for the other position, and here's the arguments against the other position. And then trying to say, which one do I think has the better argument? Who wins the debate? There might be no one, right? But that's what's mainly going on in argument, right? Okay. I could say more, and I shouldn't. So I'm gonna skip on to the two other questions that are important before we hit Anselm. So, what is perfection? This is really important, right, to the whole history of theology. The concept of perfection is incredibly important, right? And here we might say that we're dealing with the limits of value. And talking about value quite a bit throughout the course. Truth, beauty, goodness. Different kinds of value. Here's the three stages I want to take you through. So we might talk about relative value. Right? And when we talk about relative value, we use the language of better and worse. When we introduce the language of perfection, what we do is add on top of this the language of best and worst. That's the limit of that particular kind of value, the best and the worst. But it's still a particular kind of value, so we might be talking about the best blues track in the history of blues, right? Or the worst blues track in the history of blues. We can pick a variety of different values and then talk about the best and the worst. However, what we're talking about here is what you might think of as relative perfection. It's perfection relative to a particular value, right? And this is basically what Plato is talking about when he's talking about beauty, or what some people will just call excellence, right? Talking about the most excellent of a particular kind of thing. However, what's important for theology, which if you're following the kinds of distinctions I'm drawing, you might already see where I'm going, is absolute perfection. Not merely perfection relative to a particular kind of thing, particular genre of music or a particular kind of human virtue, right? But absolute perfection. And the big question is, how do you think about that? Because that's what Anselm and a lot of other people are going to be appealing to. Okay, so I'm already running a little bit late, so I have one final question and then we'll talk about Anselm and the ontological argument. And this is the question, what is existence? And if I was to also talk about this in terms of limits, I might talk about the limits of being, right? So one thing I've already pointed out during the course is that when a lot of early theologians, like Augustine and people following the Neoplatonics, talk about reality, they're talking about reality as opposed to appearance. But for them, this is a relative term, because you can have more or less reality. God has the most reality. God is the most real and the least just in appearance, right? But everything else in the world, for Augustine, has a degree of reality, right? Except the stuff that really doesn't exist, like evil, right? At which point we're just talking about appearances. And that always looks a bit kind of weird to us, because we tend to think about this stuff in terms of what you might think of as truth and falsity rather than reality and appearance. And this is an absolute notion, right? We don't really think that there are degrees of truth and falsity. There's just, look, either it's true or it's false. Either you're talking about something that exists, or you're talking about something that doesn't exist. Okay. One final thing to mention here, because it's very important for the argument I'm about to rehearse, is we might talk about the difference between actuality and possibility. Right. And that looks like an absolute distinction as well. Right. Some things are actual, things that are actually the case. Some things are merely possible. This is what often gets called a modal distinction, if anyone's interested. And this is where we're going to go now. So, those are my questions broken down. Again, don't worry if you don't follow all of that, you can always come back to it. Right. Now we want to talk about the history. So, St. Anselm of Canterbury, right, is quite an interesting figure because he's basically the first Archbishop of Canterbury. If you ever wonder why Canterbury is the most important place in the whole of sort of the Anglican Communion, it's because Anselm was the Bishop of Canterbury and actually acted to make it kind of central. Importantly as well, Anselm is this figure who transitions, or is part of this transition from the Christian theologians we've been talking about so far, who are largely, what's the right way to put it? I talked about the patristics, the church fathers, and then sort of like Augustine, who's part of the early church. But this is, and Pseudo-Dionysius, but these people kind of aren't quite in power, right? They're not part of the sort of cultural power that the church comes to have later. And what happens when the church does have this kind of cultural power is that theology becomes a kind of official institution, and you get universities being set up where people can study it. And this is where we get what gets called scholasticism, literally the philosophy of the schoolmen. And Anselm is at this point where we transition into scholasticism. Most of what gets done there will be more Aristotelian than Platonic, and that's what we'll be talking about in the next half of the semester. But it's worth mentioning this little historical point. The other thing it's important to know about Anselm is, though Anselm is famous for giving us this kind of most famous of the arguments for the existence of God, so arguments for the existence of God, right? So some of you may have come across these before. Right, we have number one, the ontological argument. and that's what Anselm invents. Other people produce versions of it. Right. 2, we have the teleological argument. And 3, we have the cosmological argument. We're not really going to talk about the teleological argument, but we will talk about the cosmological argument when we come to Aquinas. The key point I want to make here is that nobody who's making these arguments thinks that they need to make these arguments to prove that God exists. Right? Anselm's very explicit about this. Faith comes first, right? Reason comes later. Right? Making this argument is not about justifying believing in the existence of God. It's about trying to understand the truth that you already are supposed to have in your faith. So, it's an important thing to bear in mind. So how does the ontological argument work? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward, right? What it is an inference from a definition to existence. Anselm defines something into existence. So what's the definition? He says, God is absolutely perfect. God is that of which nothing greater can be imagined. No more perfect thing can be imagined than God. Right? And then he says, okay, so here we are, as our definition is absolute perfection. Right? Right? Then we've got another premise, and that premise is that to exist is better than not to exist. To exist is better than not. So he says, if, right, this absolutely perfect being doesn't exist, then we can imagine something better than it, which would be the same thing but which exists. Right? So existence is tied into the very definition itself. It just flows from the definition. Right? So our conclusion, like, God exists, right? Seems very straightforward, but also very suspicious. And throughout the history of philosophy, people have made similar arguments, and a lot of people have been very suspicious of it. Because a lot of people think you shouldn't be able to define things into existence. Right? Okay. Here's a very, very brief history of the debate. Right? So we've got Anselm. We have Anselm, he just gives that argument. And then a guy responds to Anselm. Canelo? Yes, Canelo. So he proposes this counterexample, which is his perfect island. He says, look, I can imagine a perfect island. Right, it's amazing, it's got coconut trees, there's like rum, right? It just has a wonderful time. But just because I can imagine the perfect island does not mean that that island exists. Because, yeah, if that island existed, it'd be better than my mere imaginary island. But that doesn't mean it exists. Right? Okay. Now, there's a very good response to Gengel, which is, look, you're talking about relative perfection there. That island is relatively perfect. Right? It's got all the perfections required to be a great tropical paradise. But it's not absolutely perfect. right? What Anselm's talking about is absolute perfection, right? Does that make a difference? I'll let you decide, but that's the shape of the debate. Here's another person who comes in, Kant. And Kant takes up this idea that existence is actuality. Right? What we can imagine, what we can conceive, is possibility. But you only get actuality from intuition. Right? Like existence or actuality only comes from intuition. His example is, he talks about, look, imagine I've got an imaginary £10 note in my head, right? And that imaginary £10 note might be exactly the same as an actual £10 note. They have all the same properties, right? But one of them exists and one of them doesn't, right? Existence is not a property. It's not something you add on top of, right? So, another way to put that, existence isn't a property. Because I'm running into Zoe's time, let me give you the final thing I want to mention. So, got this debate. Anselm says something, Granello and Kant respond to it. Granello is sort of like relative perfection. Later on, you get a philosopher called Hegel. You'll hear a lot about Hegel over the course of your time at university. And Hegel basically defends Anselm against both Kant and Granello. Right? And what Hegel says is, look, there's a difference between finite things and infinite things. He basically says, yeah, Kant's argument is well enough for finite things. Yeah, finite things, they're only possible, their actuality has to come from elsewhere. Right? But for something which is infinite, its actuality comes from itself. And this sounds a bit weird, because when we hear the word infinite, we think infinite means an infinite quantity. Right, an unlimited amount of something, right? So unlimited amount. But that again is just relative, right? Right, Hegel's interested in something which is unlimited completely, right? It's absolutely unlimited, or an absolute. Something that is absolutely unlimited is absolutely perfect. There is no limitations placed upon it. So, that is one way of looking at the debate over the ontological argument and whether or not you can prove the existence of God merely from the concept of God.